Hello people and welcome to another Planetside 2 video. I hope you're doing good. My name is MattiAce and here's another Planetside 2 video. Yeah, you guys missed that old intro? Started to get a little bit bored of it and I don't know. For some reason some of you guys have asked me to start using it again. And of course that's not because you guys are trolling me, right? So now as game update 13 has recently come out, there has been a lot of changes made to Planetside 2. There is quite a lot of changes that has been made to Esamir, for example. I will try to focus more of my gameplay on Esamir a little bit in the near future. At the release of this video, I have one video from post GU13, and a link to that video will be posted in the description, along with a few other links that I hope you will find interesting. There was also the introduction of a few new weapons and a few new camos, along with quite a number of balance changes that we normally see with major updates. And I'd like to focus this video on balance changes, and balance for skill, and opinions and discussions that I've been part of in the past. Now, one of the things that was changed a while back was what you see me doing here. I'm using the Dalton of the Liberator. That weapon and also the Zephyr from the Liberator was quite heavily nerfed, and in my opinion rightfully so. Now both these two weapons used to have no bullet drop, and they used to also have much more splash damage, meaning that it was much easier to hit the targets with these two weapons, and even if you did miss your target you would still deal quite massive splash damage to especially infantry players, allowing you to get a lot of kills even though you didn't really hit what you were aiming for. Now this created a lot of frustration for a lot of players, and a lot of people probably quit playing the game for that reason. And it was especially hard to deal with for infantry players, infantry outfits, and well, just generally players that specialized in infantry gameplay. And there was a lot of people that just didn't really know how to deal with it, especially if you didn't have the anti-air weapons upgraded, or if you were not into flying yourself. At the same time, a lot of Liberator pilots and gunners would argue that it isn't all that hard to use anti-air, it isn't all that hard to counter Liberators with other Liberators or with ESFs, or by using any of the lock-on missiles that you had for the heavy assault class. And there was a lot of discussions about this. One of the arguments that always repeatedly comes up in these kinds of discussions is that some players will always argue that it's very easy to get a lot of kills with a certain playstyle. One of the arguments is that it is very skillless, and it is far too easy to get all that many experience points and all that many frags without the need of practicing and improving your skill to deserve those kills. I'd have to say I am one of those players. I want the player skills to be a deciding factor in any game. Now this is my opinion. I'm sticking to it, and you cannot convince me otherwise. Now me, after the buff that was introduced quite recent after launch, I would agree with the people saying that the Liberators were overpowered. Personally, I wouldn't set foot in one of them. Instead, I focused a lot of my playtime shooting them down with my ESFs. So after a lot of discussions and a lot of posts on the forums, SOE decided to nerf the Dalton and the Zephyr. They was introduced bullet drops, and also the splash damage was reduced. And also what happened after that was that anti-air weapons got heavily buffed, along with the feature that if you deal damage from the ground to any aircraft, you will get points for just dealing damage, as an addition to getting points for kills, kill assist, and vehicle kills. Now this kind of changed up the debate, and it kind of was flipped around, as a lot of pilots was very frustrated over how hard it was to even stay alive, and how you were forced out of any major or medium-sized battle. And there was especially a lot of frustration coming from the Vanu and the NC side with the introduction of the Striker. Now the Striker is one of the most controversial weapons in this game as of now, I would say. And Again, it brings up the argument that it is so incredibly easy to use, being that it is a lock-on weapon that requires little to no aim, and it deals quite significant amount of damage, and it's really hard to dodge it. So this brings us to skill-based or non-skill-based weapons. And this is a very complex question. It stirs up a lot of emotions, and it brings out a lot of frustration from a lot of players. Now, the most well-known and the most debated weapon when it comes to these kinds of discussions in first-person shooter games is the grenade launcher. You will find the grenade launcher in a lot of games, and it's commonly known as the noob tube. Now, I'm pretty sure you understand the reason why it's called the noob tube, and what kind of players that would call it the noob tube, and what kind of players would want this to be nerfed or removed. At the same time, in any first-person shooter game that I played where you have the grenade launcher, it is also a very popular weapon for a lot of players. So now it is of course very easy to personally take offense when somebody says that your favorite playstyle or one of the playstyles that you are using is a low skill or a very easy playstyle, and that people want to see that nerfed for that reason. But I think that most people that play a game like Planetside 2, they're probably part of an outfit, and if they know or feel by themselves that they are somewhere around the average skill player, they are cool with that, and they know that there is a reason why they are not better, and they probably don't care all that much because this is just a game. They are having fun anyway, and there are other things in their lives that are more important than improving their skills in a game like Planetside 2. So with people with this kind of honesty and maturity, it is most likely quite easy to have a productive discussion about the weapon balance if this is something that you are interested in. Now, you may not have the same opinion as the one you are discussing with, but at least you can come to a certain agreement, certain conclusion, and if you disagree, you would most likely just have a different opinion about what is important. One of the topics that I've been part of quite a lot is the rocket pods of the ESFs. Now, many players would believe that just because I fly a lot and just because I use the rocket pods, I would want the rocket pods to be as powerful as possible, and I would not want to see any kind of nerf. Instead, I would just want to nerf anything that counters flying and using the rocket pods. Now, some of the people that have been following my channel knows that this is not true. I have repeatedly suggested nerfs to the rocket pods. I have also suggested several times that I would like to see them to be more skill-based, and I have also come up with a couple of different suggestions for this. Now, the rocket pods was quite early on nerfed, and the nerf that was made was to the splash damage, meaning that shooting into groups of people and killing people that you don't hit was no longer as effective. So now this kind of balance change, nerf, whatever you want to call it, makes the game more skill-based. Now to players that are experienced with esports, for example, players that have been playing competitively do not need the explanation of skill-based. The tactics that you use in Clone Wars, for example, are far more advanced and far more to the point than in public gameplay or like in a game like Planetside 2. All timings are much more crucial, and it's much more important that you know when to sacrifice yourself, when to play it more safe, knowing when and where to attack, and knowing when and where to defend. I could go on for a long time. Now, when it comes to the understanding of skill-based, I believe that most so-called casual gamers understand this just as well as any high-skilled professional or esports player. Sometimes it's just that it gets a little bit too emotional, and a few people have a tendency to personally take offense when their playstyle has been mentioned as a low-skill playstyle. Now, this might have to do with personal immaturity or maybe low self-esteem. And to mention myself again as an example, normally when we fly around in the Mosi outfit on Cobalt as TR or as the Fool outfit on the VS side, we sometimes talk about the skill pods or the pro pods. I'm sure it goes without saying that we are just making fun of the rocket pods, as most experienced pilots would agree that using rocket pods against the infantry players isn't really the most skill-based way of flying. Now, if you have the ability to see on your own playstyle that there is something about it that isn't skill-based and you have no problem admitting it, it gets much more easier to have a discussion. Is this good for the game? Is it bad for the game? Does this need a change? And if so, how and how much? Another example of these kinds of discussions that I've been part of is anti-air. For example, the Skyguard and the Burstamax. Now, aside from their effectiveness of countering what you've seen me doing in this video, flying ESFs and gunning Liberators, many players have expressed their frustration over anti-air being completely useless once you have done your job at killing or deterring aircrafts. Now, I did show in some of my videos that the Skyguard and the Burstamax was actually quite a lot more effective at infantry players, and the Skyguard also against some vehicles than a lot of people would want to admit or even knew about. Now, the reaction to this was a bit mixed. Some people were grateful and learned from it, and I'm really glad that I could have helped you guys out, if any of you are watching this video as well. Others was quite upset about it. They did not at all like to see how anti-air weapons was actually quite effective as an all-round weapon in some situations, and also how, even though I was very inexperienced with these weapons, I could right away from the first spawn do fairly well with them. So my input to the air versus anti-air balance discussions was that anti-air was quite underestimated by some players, and they needed the same adjustment or a similar adjustment to what aircrafts had earlier been given. And then we have a weapon type that is probably the most controversial that I've ever brought up, and the one that has caused the most amount of frustration and reactions of the Planetside 2 community, and this is shotguns. I just want to point out that I actually do find MattiAce to be a bit more frustrating than shotguns, but I think one of the reasons why people have reacted so hard on my opinions about shotguns is that I don't use them myself. So let me talk about that for a little moment. Many of the weapons and vehicles in Planetside 2 are completely unique to Planetside 2, or at least for me they are unique. Flying, the mechanics of flying and the weapons we use in Planetside 2 is, for me, a first-time experience. The way maxes work, even tanks and anti-air, is also, for me, unique to Planetside 2. But that does not go for shotguns. I've tested them in the virtual reality room, and I've also seen other people use them, and they are very similar or close enough to some of the other games I've played so that I can have an opinion about them. And like I mentioned before, I considered shotguns to be very overpowered in Battlefield 3, Bad Company 2, and some other games before that. In the Electro Sports League, for example, in Bad Company 2, all shotguns but one was forbidden. And the reason for that was that they were simply overpowered, and they were overpowered in regard to how you compared them to the other weapons that you had access to in the game. And that's the thing about the balance between weapons is how they are compared to one another. Some of these things can be proven by statistics, other things cannot. But the main idea of why shotguns were banned was because in this esports community, the players wanted the game to be based on player skill, and low skill weapons didn't add anything fun to the competition, to the gameplay, or the community. So now, if you have a different opinion about shotguns for whatever reason, you think they are good for the game, you think they add something positive to the game, I'm sure there are some arguments you can find for that. Now, for example, you might find my comparison to Bad Company 2 and competitive gaming completely irrelevant, being that the Planetside 2 is a completely different game. You may also have the opinion that it is not a negative thing to have weapons that require less skill, because these weapons are a bit more situational, and being that if weapons that requires less skill are powerful, it will even out the differences between more experienced player and less experienced players, making it more even and making the difference of skill less relevant. If that's your opinion, then that's your opinion, and you are definitely entitled to have that opinion. I, for one, will respect that opinion, and I know that, for example, DICE are purposely developing their games in that regard, so that lesser skilled players are supposed to have a chance against more experienced, more high skilled players. It is quite clear that Planetside 2 is developed with kind of the same thought as what you've heard from how DICE develop the Battlefield series, with the weapons and vehicles that are not supposed to be all that difficult to use, and that player skill should not be the deciding factor in all engagements. So now the fact that we know this doesn't change the fact that we still have a balanced discussion. We will still have a lot of different opinions about basically every weapon, every class, every vehicle, and all the factions in this game, and we are still trying to find a certain kind of balance, even though that balance may not be based on player skill. But even though skill is not going to be the deciding factor in all the situations, it is still at least a part of the gameplay, and in order to have a discussion about that, it is quite important to understand that the different weapons have a different learning curve, requires more experience to learn how to handle, and requires more skill from the player in order for them to be effective. And once we start getting a grasp of that fundamental information, we need to decide what do we want to do with this information. In what direction does the majority of the community want the balance to go? Do we want skill to be a deciding factor? And if we don't, how much do we want to diminish skill as a deciding factor, and in what way? So now one of the many problems with these discussions is, of course, human emotions. If you take personal offense when somebody says that a playstyle that you are using a lot is not all that skill-based, and somebody wants that to be nerfed, then it is up to you whether or not you can take this with maturity and have a reasonable discussion about it, with the goal of having a better game and making it more fun for the majority of the players. And some players would of course do the opposite. They would either rage about it, or they would, in some quite rare occasions, try to find ways of making it sound like a weapon that doesn't require all that much skill is harder to use than it actually is. And it can lead to a lot of misinformation when, especially when people that are good at talking do this. And that's the thing, there is a lot of people that are good with words, people that know how to choose their words in a certain way or a tone of voice in a certain way that artificially can make them sound more intelligent and as if they knew more about the subject than they actually do. So now take this weapon, the Marauder, for example. By spamming this weapon on the ground next to infantry players will in quite a number of occasions give you a lot of kills, even though you don't even hit a single target. This is commonly known as a low skill weapon, and whether or not you like this kind of weapon, that is of course your opinion, but if you try to find ways of making it sound like this is a high skill weapon, then it gets really complicated to have a mature discussion about this weapon.
So much skill.
Now, I for one would prefer it if these types of weapons would have a smaller role in Planetside 2, if they were less effective, and if it was more rewarding to have a good aim, and for example, if predicting a target's movement was more valuable than, for example, using a lock-on missile. Now, one of the major reasons why I have all these opinions about Planetside 2 is that the fundamental gameplay of Planetside 2, the basic weapons of this game, and the mechanics of some of the vehicles and the weapons in general are really good. That's my opinion. Another thing is that as tanks and aircrafts have been nerfed in order to find a better balance, I think those adjustments were very well done, and to the most part I agreed with almost everything that happened with, I'm talking about the Liberators, the Zephyr and Dalton that I talked about earlier, and also the rocket pods. And when it comes to tanks, it was the HE shells and heat. And when I saw these changes taking place, I really believed that SOE had the same opinions about balance that I had, and I was really excited about it, and I was looking forward to the new content, new weapons, and everything else that was promised in the upcoming patches, and some of it that we have seen. And it seems to me that when splash damage was nerfed from tanks and air, most people seemed to agree that this was good, because it wasn't as easy to just farm infantry, and skill was more rewarded. Now, unfortunately, in my opinion, the balance changes the last couple of patches have kind of gone in the opposite direction, and also with the introduction of some of these weapons that I'm talking about. And also, in my opinion, shotguns are a little bit too powerful for the lack of skill required to use them, and also because of the map design of this game, because shotguns are very, very powerful in situations where you capture points, meaning that the base capture mechanics in Planetside 2 will always force you into close quarter combat. And for example, outside in a situation like this, shotguns might not be as effective, but in the other hand, infantry gameplay in these situations are not that effective anyway, so the long or mid-range weapons can many times have their value denied by vehicles and aircrafts. So now for the last part of this video, I'd like to say that this game is about having fun and finding those epic moments that you will only find in Planetside 2. And one of the best ways for most people to do that is to join an outfit and play with a relatively large group of people. And keep in mind, we don't have to be the best players. You don't have to be like Hot and Spicy, Golden Goose or Jellyfish in order to have fun flying an ESF. Nor do you have to be as experienced as, for example, Chun or Chirikan and be an expert at basically everything that exists in this game, especially vehicles, because you can have a lot of fun anyway, and common sense will go a long way. If you make sure you've got your shit together, you will be respected by anybody that is worth playing with, and most likely will you have a blast doing so. If there is one advice I would give to anybody that is especially important in Planetside 2 is proper communication. The way you talk in TeamSpeak or whatever program you are using, being able to know what information is important, knowing when to talk and when not to talk, understanding when it is okay to make a lot of silly jokes and goof around in TeamSpeak, and also understanding when it is not okay to do that and instead focus at the game. Basic stuff like that will be very, very valuable in any outfit or any group of people you play with in this game. Now anyway, this video became a lot longer than I planned, so please let me know what you think. Any feedback is of course welcome, and that's gonna have to be all, so bye for now.
It's so bad against infantry.